Hello and welcome to the Frans van Kat interview. I'm Annette Young. More than 50 years on, it's a war that to this day still casts a shadow over French diplomacy in the region. I'm talking about the Algerian War of Independence, which became a beacon for those living under colonial or racial oppression. The struggle of the Algerian National Liberation Front, or FLN as it's known, also started to reshape the way in which wars were fought. Here to talk to me about why this was the case is American historian Matthew Connelly. His book, A Diplomatic Revolution, Algeria's Fight for Independence and the Origin of the Post-Cold War Era, has just been translated into French. Matthew, thank you for joining us. First of all, given you're an American, why did you choose this particular topic? Because it doesn't strike me as an obvious subject for research for a historian from the English-speaking world.
Well, that's right. And in fact, when I was still in graduate school, when I was being trained to be an historian, most of my colleagues and certainly all my advisors, were still studying things like Cold War history, the Berlin crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was, even then, the history that seemed to matter. But back in in fact, for 20 years now, when people have thought about the history that can help explain our own time, I think most of us think it's not so much the struggle between Moscow and Washington. I think more and more of us realize that it's the history of North-South conflict and efforts to come to a new relationship between North and South that can really help us understand the dilemmas, the challenges of our own day. And so that's why I thought that this struggle that is still seen as emblematic of relations between North and South and the often conflictual and passionate relations between them, was the one that might hold the key to understand our own day.
And certainly as far as the French are concerned, it's seen as a very important part of contemporary history. But I would say for people outside of France, they perhaps would argue that it isn't that important.
Well, there are some who would say that. I often talk to people for whom the only memory they have of the Algerian War is having seen a film like The Battle of Algiers. And what I like to ask them is if you've seen that film, do you remember why the Battle of Algiers began? And that begins a discussion about how it is that the Algerians realized they couldn't win a conventional struggle with the French. They didn't have the tanks and the planes to defeat them in the streets of their capital. Instead, they decided to launch this wave of bombings and assassinations in Algiers because they knew the way it was going to resonate in the international media. They knew that it was going to begin a debate, not just in France, but around the world, about the future of France's territory in North Africa.
And that's the premise of your book, is the fact that the Algerian independence movement, for what was then a very revolutionary approach at that time, really went out of their way to win public opinion, didn't they?
That's right. And it was a struggle because, of course, they were taking on France, which was supposed to be the protector of the rights of man. France, then and now was a great power in the world with tremendous influence and friends around the world. But what they did was they managed to put France on the defensive to show how France was violating the rights of man in Algeria, what was supposed to be a part of la patrie, part of the territory of France itself. And so they used press conferences, they used youth congresses, they began to rally the support of other countries that had just become independent, and they began to isolate France in the world, and finally made de Gaule himself realize that France was never going to be a great power again unless it finally let go of this burden.
And Matthew, those lessons are still being applied today. For instance, they took the issue to the United Nations, and we have in September the Palestinians who will be heading to the UN General Assembly seeking recognition of an independent state. So clearly they look to places like what happened in Algeria as a benchmark as such, as to what can be achieved.
That's right. And in fact, Yasser Arafat was in Algiers in 1962 when they finally, that is, the rebels finally marched through their capital in triumph. And he consciously modeled the Palestine Liberation Organization after the FLN. And he adopted much the same strategy. He knew that just like the Algerians, they were not able to defeat their enemy in taking territory and holding it. Instead, they had to wage this struggle in the media and through international organizations, especially the United Nations.
So to what extent was this conflict the beginning of the post-Cold War era, and why?
Well, it was the beginning of that era because of the way it began. If you go back to the very beginning of this struggle, you have to look at things like population change, migration, the way North Africans were beginning, without having jobs in their own country, beginning to move to Europe, the way they were exposed to new ideas, and the way they had ideas of their own about what their future should be and how their future needed to be one that they would make on their own. And so in many ways, by using the international media, by using new communications technology, by finding a global audience, and by mobilizing Muslims all across Europe and beyond, they found a way of advancing their cause, and in that way in changing the world by taking advantage of some of these ways in which the world was already changing.
Now, to this day, there's still very much a complicated relationship between France and Algeria. It's still tricky in France to talk openly about the events in Algeria. You've certainly got a situation where both parties have failed to publicly acknowledge the wrongs that were committed by either side. And it's interesting that your book was published how long ago in English?
Oh, it was back in 2002.
And we're in 2011 and it's only just been published in French. Do you think that was also a factor in the reason why it took such a long time to get into print?
Well, in a way, I'm not surprised because if you think of it, the critical histories of the Vichy era, when France under German occupation, the way in which so many French decided to be complicit or to cooperate with their occupiers, that history took more than a generation before it ever began to be reported and finally taught in French schools. So if you think of it, it's not so surprising that it's taken more than a generation for French people to begin to come to terms with the Algerian War. Again, not just as a national drama in which France liberated Algeria, but to begin to realize that this was an international struggle. And in fact, in that way, find that once again, French history matters not only to the French, but it helps us understand how the world came to be as it is.
It's still, however, a very complicated relationship between these two nations, isn't it?
It really is. I think that you can go back, to the early 1990s when Algeria was facing an Islamist insurrection, and find even then that as much as the French, wanted to support the Algerian government, they found that, in fact, their support was a kiss of death in a sense. They had to be extremely careful because any kind of support in the Algerian government would in some ways delegitimize that government in the eyes of the Algerian people. So they've always had to maintain a very delicate relationship with the government in Algiers, even though at the same time they've wanted to keep North Africa as a region that is one in which France still has a predominant influence, especially vis-a-vis the United States.
It's certainly very interesting talking about the subject with my French colleagues who are always very quick to point out that Algeria was a department and not a territory, unlike Tunisia and other places, and how much that kicked into their view of the conflict. Do you think that the French are more open these days to listen to other views about what actually transpired?
I think that, with a generational change, you have, younger people who didn't live through those events. Even so, their teachers did, and they have ideas of their own. But nonetheless, over time, especially as French people begin to look back to the history that can help them understand contemporary France, more and more they look back to episodes like the Algerian War to understand, for instance, why it is France is as diverse as it is today. Now, of course, you could read that history in different ways, and for some it makes them extremely pessimistic about the possibility for reconciliation between different communities in France. But I think that history actually can teach us other lessons as well about how people, once they begin to realize the potential and, in fact, the demand for finding ways in which different communities can live side by side, I think they may begin to find new ways not just to learn from that history, but to make a different kind of future.
Now, to bring the story forward, the FLN to this day still dominates Algeria's political leadership. President Bouteflika, of course, is still running the country, but they themselves are facing a struggle of a different kind at the moment, aren't they? And we see a disenchanted public who wants greater democracy, and we saw back in February those protests. Do you think we're seeing the end of the FLN, period as such?
Well, it's astonishing to me, as somebody who's been studying Algeria for 20 years, that we're still predicting the end of the FLN era. It's been a long time, right, that we've wondered, when will that generation that came of age, that established its legitimacy through this epic struggle, when they'll finally pass from the scene. Well, it hasn't happened yet. And I think one reason was because that struggle gave them, the legitimacy to to run Algiers and do it for decades, and at times with I think very little to show, for the tremendous assets that Algeria has. Not just in terms of the things we think of, the oil, but in terms of a population that is still, one that's quite conscious of its history, that's politically conscious, and has so much potential that sadly the FLN has not found ways to realize.
And certainly in the context of the Arab Spring, we've seen very limited protests, haven't we, in Algeria?
That's right, and I think it's because Algerians are conscious, not only of this older history of the war for independence, but also of some more recent history, the terrible civil conflict that began in the early 90s and lasted more than a decade, and one that has the potential for starting up again. So I think Algerians are very leery of once again taking their political differences into the street and trying to reconcile them through guns. So I think that Algerians are very cautious, about pushing things that far.
Matthew Connelly, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. That's it for this edition of the France 24 interview. Stay tuned for news and headlines, which will be coming up shortly.